and a half together, an hour with Dr. Yusoff or so, 45 minutes around that to an hour, and then a little time for question and answer afterwards. So at the end of our conversation, you can put questions in the chat, and Dr. Ye and I will do our best to field those and carry out the Q&A. So welcome, we're so glad you can join us. But before I introduce my colleague, Dr. Emily Ye, who will welcome Dr. Yusoff, we'd like to acknowledge that the University of Colorado Boulder sits on the territories of the Ute, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Eastern Shoshone peoples, and that 48 tribal nations are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. It's critical not only to acknowledge that, but also to actively address the particular harms that settler colonialism and institutions who benefit from colonialism, including CU Boulder, perpetuate on Indigenous lands and peoples, especially in the context of this event, which is part of a Mellon Sawyer seminar, where we're seeking to attend to more capacious humanities, arts, and sciences-based alliances for long-term ecological transformation. Simultaneously, we assert that such alliances must also acknowledge the sociocultural, artistic, linguistic, and other strategies that Indigenous communities have used and continue to use to respond to intensive ecological disruptions. So I'd like to thank our institutional partners today and our collaborative partners. The program is generously funded by a Sawyer Seminar on the Comparative Study of Cultures grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Additionally, we thank our institutional partners here at CU Boulder, the NEST, Nature, Environment, Science, and Technology Studio for the Arts, the Natural Hazards Center, the Art and Art History Department, and the Center for Native American and Indigenous Studies. So please visit our Environmental Futures website and you can learn more and register for future events, including next Monday night. We'll have a talk by Jacqueline Patterson, who's the director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program. So without further ado, let me turn it over and thank my colleague, Dr. Emily Ye, who's professor and chair of the Department of Geography here at the University of Colorado Boulder. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Erin. Thank you for inviting me to help moderate this event today. So today's public lecture is the first of many in a series this spring, and they form part of the 2020-2021 Mellon Sawyer Seminar, Deep Horizons, Making Visible an Unseen Spectrum of Ecological Casualties and Prospects. The seminar traverses multiple disciplines and perspectives to investigate intersectional questions around the changing planet as it affects specific peoples, communities, wildlife species, and ecosystems in various and inequitable ways. The project calls for empathy, for attunement, and for an outlook that encompasses a diversity of individuals, communities, and collaborative entities committed to climate justice and more ethically durable futures. So as Erin just mentioned, you can visit the Environmental Futures website to learn more and to register for upcoming events, and hopefully that will be in the chat. And finally, if you have questions about the series at the close of Dr. Yusoff's presentation, Erin should be able to help address them. So Dr. Yusoff is a professor of, quote, inhuman geography in the School of Geography at Queen Mary University of London, after previous lectureships at Lancaster University and the University of Exeter. She's actively engaged in the arts, for example, as a curator of a project called Polar, the Art and Science of Climate Change, which is a multidisciplinary project about the curation and production of climate change knowledge in the polar regions, as well as one called Weather Permitting, which was a collaborative art and science project investigating weather and climate change. And interestingly, this one included fieldwork not only in the Arctic and Antarctic, but also here in Boulder at the National Snow and Ice Data Center, or NSIDC, which is part of CERES, which I'm familiar with through the Department of Geography. She's also made an appearance as time traveler in the recent film installation by the Autolith Group called Infinity Minus Infinity, which itself draws on and is inspired by her theorization of the racial formation of geology. Dr. Yusoff's research centers on dynamic Earth events, such as abrupt climate change, biodiversity loss, and extinction. Her work addresses political aesthetics, social theory, and questions of geologic life within the proposed geologic epoch that we're all kind of used to hearing about now of the Anthropocene. Her research examines how inhuman and non-organic dimensions of life have consequences for how we understand issues of fossil fuels, of human-Earth relations, and materiality in the politics of life. She draws from contemporary feminist philosophy, from critical human geography, and from the earth sciences. And she's particularly interested in the opportunities that the Anthropocene presents for rethinking the interactions between the earth sciences and human geography in the, quote, geosocial formations of anthropogenic change. Professor Yusoff is very widely published in prominent journals of geography, such as Society in Space, Antipode, and Cultural Geographies, as well as in interdisciplinary journals of the humanities, such as Theory, Culture, and Society, and Social Text. And in 2019, she published a book, A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, with the University of Minnesota Press. And Professor Yusoff's talk today is entitled The Inhumanities. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kathryn Yusoff.
Thank you very much, Erin and Emily, for that introduction. Let me just try and get my, can everybody see? Brilliant. Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me to present in this series and to the audience as well. So it's nice to actually see some of you. So I'm not just talking to myself in a room. It's nice to kind of be able to see you and imagine this as a conversation. I hope some of these things will be kind of provocative, that I've got to say will be kind of provocative, but also kind of will come back in your questions. So what I want to do today is talk about the inhumanities, and this is a term that I've been kind of cutting through in lots of different ways for the past, I don't know, 4 or 5 years of trying to kind of reckon with the inhuman and the kind of occupations of the inhuman. So what I want to do today is think about that within social theory and within sort of 4 dimensions. And this is a kind of way to set out a number of concerns about the environmental humanities and kind of Anthropocene cultures more generally. And I appreciate the irony of this, given the excellent speakers that make up this series of talks, which, you know, I think kind of really thankfully rethinks the constitutive space of whiteness and dominant space of whiteness within the environmental humanities. So I make these comments in light of a kind of reinvestment in the humanities, but also its kind of long history of complicity in scripting the effectual geographies of imperialism and settler colonialism and upholding their racial geologics, as much by omission as anything else. But I think kind of the humanities had a particular role in crafting the aesthetics of those racial geologics. So I want to offer today the proposition of the inhumanities as an analytic to address the material confluences of race and environment in the epistemic construction of the humanities and social sciences. And specifically, I'm saying this within the context of the Anthropocene and its explicit formation of a political geology. So I want to argue that centering race is a way to reconceptualize and challenge the disciplinary approaches of the environmental humanities and the Anthropocene and Anthropocene studies, while it also is a way to understand why it's such a hostile environment for Indigenous and Black studies scholars. So foregrounding the conjoined historic geographies of racialization and earth and ecological transformation through the discipline of colonial practices, or what I call white geology, within the context of current settler colonialism and neo-extractivism, sets the conditions, I would argue, for thinking materially about decolonization as a geologic process, which is a way to think about not just how roads must fall, for example, but also how the racial formations of his diamond and gold mines and all that floats on that extracted value historically and contemporaneously might be dismantled. So if we think about desedimenting the social life of geology, we can begin to think about a method for understanding how Black and brown subjects are subtended in the unearthing of geopowers. So these geopowers that accrue from geologic extraction, and the histories of grammar. And here I'm talking about things like process evaluation, land, territory, and the verticality of relation in terms of the extraction of value from the earth. And these epistemes of matter and the dominant figures of the human and the anthropos. So this is to understand that racial violence is also the violence of matter. And to address that violence is to critically understand histories of matter and their geologics. And particularly for me is a concern with the inhuman and this oscillating relationship between the inhumane. So I'm briefly going to lay out these 4 dimensions and then move on to a kind of more in-depth discussion of how the inhuman frames the ground of subjectivity and its possibilities in codependent transformations of the earth. So the first kind of cut through this is to think of inhumanism through its vertical geopolitics, what might be understood as the racial geophysics of anti-Blackened gravities. So racializing access and historic material dynamics that pushes down to lift up. So we can think of this as the kind of racial flip of geology. And to situate this idea, I want to start with 2 guide quotes. And the first is from the Jamaican theorist, Sylvia Wynter. And she says, what was this something, I asked myself, that needed as its own condition of existence, the systematic impoverishment of the darker peoples of the world, the no less systematic inferiorization of the Black and other non-white peoples of the earth. And then my second quote, taken from the film, the 1950s film, Salt of the Earth, about mining and the geologies of settler colonialism in New Mexico. The central character of Esperanza lays out the stratigraphy of relations confronting her husband, Ramon. And she says, why are you afraid to have me at your side? Do you think you can have dignity only if I have none? The Anglo bosses look down on you and you hate them for it. Stay in your place, you dirty Mexican. That's what they tell you. But why must you say to me, stay in your place? Do you feel better having someone lower than you? Whose neck shall I stand on to make me feel superior? And what will I get out of it? I don't want anything lower than I am. I am low enough already. I want to rise and push everything up as we go. And if you can't understand this, you're a fool. So both these quotes, I think, tell us about the dual dynamics of racialization, and that it has a geophysics, it has a pressure, not just a verticality, but a set of pressures and in the elevation of white surfaces, there is the subjugation of the wretched into the earth. And thus the geophysics is racialized and gendered. And it's in this fractured stratigraphy of relation that is extraction that I would argue that race is the governing structure. So race both kind of covers over, but also manages this kind of biopolitics of this relation. So, and we can see this here in this very kind of crude graph, but around environmental exposures. So this is the inverse of the kind of the sort of flotation of white surfaces. So the second thing I want to think about is the inhuman as a proximity between the inhuman and inhumane. And between the so-called non-living matter of the inhuman and the conditions and categories of experience that proceed as if persons were inhuman property and devoid of subjecthood. And here, most notably, is the trade in human beings under slavery. So the Inhumanities refers to the classificationary systems and the natural philosophies of thought that are desubjectifying. So they target particular populations into things and properties of energy, and structurally subjugating to Black and brown life in the afterlives of invasion, slavery, and imperialism. So the dual effect of this subjection is to underground agency in a body of matter rather than rights under slavery and settler colonialism. So blackness was seen as a source of energy that could be cultivated as a signifier and a carceral category to produce value through extraction, in which race was implicit in the material reproduction of whiteness and settler futurity. As indigeneity is folded into the unit of land. In both these matter flatterings, racial formations are driven by the extractive impulse, which builds capitalism into a global functioning system that is world altering. Race was then the codification of the unequal distribution of geopowers, its accumulation, and the placement of certain lives in the material and psychic proximity to the inhuman, and therefore less conspicuous in their judicial and ethical recognition of political subjectivity. So these proximities are what Edward Glisson calls painful histories, alongside the ongoing structures of the attempted erasure of Indigenous people and the brutal abandonments and orphanage of the Middle Passage, and all those diasporic journeys that live in silence between. So it's not just the shadow world in colonial lives and its afterlives. Glisson claims this intimacy with the inhuman as his own, and as a growth that should not be disavowed, and which grew out of the resistance to the enslaving will. Talking to Mathia Dewani on the Queen Mary II, he says, Columbus had left for what he called the New World, and I am the one who returned from it as something else, a free entity, not only free, but a being who has gained something. In relation to the unity of the enslaving will, we have the multiplicity of the anti-slavery will. The very ground and possibility of a future, Glisson's work suggests, requires owning this earth and its watery inheritance, but owning without originating in a single originary story. In this resistance, he speaks to the configuration of colonialism in a genealogical account of racial difference and its erasure of the origins of others. So resisting a narrative of overcoming or redemption, Glisson's call is one of openness to the proximities and assertion of the political need to build up what I think of as a poetics of reconstitution that materially builds through those erasures, putting words on long abandoned bones and taking up stories from the silt of the earth where they lay. This alluvial subjectivity of dark oceanic abyss, what Fanon calls the abysmal, replaces the divisions and segregations of the world and specifies them in their geographies. Contrary to the Imperial Archive, implicit in Glisson's work and that of Fanon and Césaire is an inhuman solidarity as the basis of a history and the present of a relation, what might be regarded as a letting go of the mastery of matter in Juliette Singh's terms, and its normative modes of apprehension as nature and natural resource. So recognition of the porosity of being with the inhuman highlights the very imbricated worlds of extraction across earth and subjects. So third, inhumanism as a mode of subjectivity that decenters the Enlightenment or humanist subject. So echoing Winter, Alexander Wahaley asks, what different modalities of the human come to light if we do not take the liberalist humanist figure of man as the master subject, but focus on how humanity has been imagined and lived by those subjects excluded from this domain? Concentrating on what different modalities of the subject come to light, we might also ask a parallel question about what environments, geophysics, and ecologies can also be imagined and lived if we abandon the humanist figure of man and start from the location of inhumanism to build the humanities. These are practices that range from institutions, societies, and empirical data, practices that built the humanities, funded from the spoils of invasion, slavery, and extraction, to the natural history practices of racial dehumanization and subjective codification. An inhuman epistemology would go looking for impossible projects that were crafted by those making freedom in the tight registers of colonialism and its afterlives, which is to say that the Inhumanities already lives in its resistance, in the resistance and survivals that have been made in the violent registers of the humanities and in its deadening spaces of the inhumane. So the Inhumanities can be tooled as a biopolitical inoculation against the presumptive logics of the environmental humanities to take their grounding subject as read, which means staying with the Enlightenment Kantian subject that is built on and through the pain of others. And as such is a subject that does not consciously carry its inheritance as a site of remediation and redress. As a child of a colonial discipline, geography, and an interloper in the environmental humanities, I'm deeply aware how easily this inheritance is slipped in the rush towards various forms of redemption narratives and action-orientated savings in a much depleted environmental world. In Julieta Singh's work, Unthinking Mastery, she puts forward an argument for dehumanism as a critical mode for decentering the white patriarchal subject and dislodging the tyranny of the white settler family and of mastery itself, what might be understood as the mythos of white man's burden, or in the Anthropocene, white man's overburden. Singh says she's interested in, quote, to explore as well how such dwellings might enable us to become exiled from subjectivities founded on and through mastery. This is a practice I call dehumanism, a practice of recuperation, of stripping away the violent foundations, always structural and ideological, of colonial or neo-colonial mastery that continue to render some beings more human than others. Dehumanism requires not an easy repudiation and renunciation of dehumanization, but a form of radical dwelling in and with dehumanization through the narrative excesses and insufficiencies of the good human, a cohabitation that acts on and through us in order to imagine other forms of political allegiance, end quote. So Singh seeks to summon the hopeful, what she says, the hopeful spirit of queer inhumanisms. Dehumanism begins with the dehumanized, humans and their others, as a critical point of departure. So in this shifting of the inhumanism to the dehumanism, Singh seeks to overcome what she says a prefix that does not, she says, intuitively signal the history of making non-human subjects and forms of being. So Singh's project of unlearning and unmaking of narrative forms of mastery is compelling, and it gathers together dehumanization and the decolonial in a way that connects the reach of colonial mastery across domains to highlight the, quote, denial of the master's own dependency on other bodies. So Singh's shift of inhumanism to dehumanism, I think, is a useful reminder in terms of addressing the legacies of colonialism, as it shifts attention from the racial schema of whiteness as a category of mere accumulation to sharpen a focus on the attachment to supremacy that propels whiteness as a distinct formation and grammar. My own persistence with the term inhumanism is, as with my chosen title of Professor of Inhuman Geography, is precisely to work against the intuitive, to grasp its non-normative workings and to let in, as it were, its cosmic potential alongside those inhumane geographies that are its discipline's legacy. A colonial history of inhumanism that precisely generated and languaged a crossing of the abysmal divide between the human and inhuman, and in which space a new language was born to speak otherwise of this condition. This is what Fanon referred to in the introduction of Black Skins, White Masks as the cosmic yes. In his exacting and elegiac engagement with Fanon, David Marriott shows how Fanon's understanding of the zone of non-being is not, quote, a descent into this zone as nihilism or despair. Rather, he counters with a vision of subjectivity as a yes that vibrates to cosmic harmonies, end quote. So descent into the zone of non-being produces this yes and its revolutionary power. It's revolutionary precisely because the anti-Black world cannot contain or sustain the affirmation of Black life as life. And this is a quote from Marriott. As having a claim on the world. This claim and this yes is the positivity of what becomes political violence in Fanon's later work, end quote. So that cosmic yes answers an epistemic invention in the register of its inhuman emplacement. So in his revolutionary humanism, we can see Fanon has kind of anchored that, that invention in the cosmos. And he says, I am Black, I am in total fusion with the world, in sympathetic affinity with the earth, losing my id in the heart of the cosmos. And the white man, however intelligent he may be, is incapable of understanding Louis Armstrong or songs from the Congo. I am Black not because of a curse, but because my skin has been able to capture all the cosmic effluvia. I am truly a drop of sun under the earth, end quote. So in the realm of the embodied, if we think of embodied geology, then we can think also of the Inhumanities as a cosmic affinity. And this is my kind of fourth dimension, in which to recognize the Inhumanities as a praxis and also an aid memoir to grapple with the violent segregations of nature and subjective life. Divisions that have riven a chasm between what is designated as life with a capital L, so those kind of preferential forms of subjectification, and the orientation to organize from that site of division, and what is cast as non-life or the extractable. So the Inhumanities and its cosmic dimensions of an expanding universe are deeply interested in the stretch of the geophysical world in making spaces of freedom. And you can't see it here, I think, because it's sort of blocked out by the images, but that's just a reference to the North Star and the way in which kind of like the North and the North Star became a kind of cosmic location as much as a real place in escaping from slavery. So while pressure has been put on the figure of the human, its historicity, racialized and gendered and sexualized forms, it's not just a hermeneutics of the human that is needed. So not just a kind of to map the transition from colonial man to Anthropocene man, from master subject man to matter subject anthropos, for example, but alongside an unearthing of the ground that materially constitutes the figure of the human through an examination of what might be termed these geologies of race. Geologies of race is a way to understand the conjoined material praxis of colonial terraforming and subject forming, its geosocial relation and its legacies in the present. The material incorporation of the European subject and its settler colonial kin in terms of value, accumulation, and subjective forms were defined against what was classified as fossil nature, so indigeneity, and fossil energy, the enslaved, to transform the ecological and energetic organization of the world as a global geography. So as the Anthropocene empirically describes a new field of geologically informed power relations that focuses attention on the geographies of the inhuman and geologic forces, as well as the politics of non-life, it also represents an explicit formation of political geology that is racialized from its onset in the geologies of colonialism since 1492. So the inhuman and the Anthropocene. In Aimé Césaire's discourse on colonialism, his much quoted line suggests, at the very time when it's most often mouths the word, the West has never been further from being able to live a true humanism, a humanism made to the measure of the world. So as the human is being measured in the world as a planetary geologic agent, Césaire's question remains pertinent to how the measure of this altering world is made, and the organization of its disciplinary formations and institutions, as well as the natural philosophy through which we encounter the future and that narration. So in another searing critique of humanism, Frantz Fanon ties the unrealized figure of a true humanism to the earth as a wretched counterpoint, whereby the inhuman residues of the colonial project abide as discarded matter, and the imposition of that as a subjective category on the discarded. So If we think about in the context of securing natural resources and the wealth of settler societies through the colonial geoengineering of the planet, the inhumanity of the colonial subject forged black and blackened, to use Christina Sharp's term, subject category in the inhuman, a designation that materially functioned as a racialized understrata to the white surfaces of capital accumulation. Those blackened colonial afterlives in what Ronaldo Walcott calls modernity's project of unfreedom are still very much present in the political geologies of climate change vulnerabilities and the wasting effects of racial capitalism and neo-extractive economies. Yet, there's also a need not simply to retool this relation in another determinism, that, as Kathryn McKittrick cautions, equates Black bodies with degraded matter. So the narrative arc of humanism, David Scott suggests in conversation with Sylvia Winter, quote, is often told as a kind of European coming of age story. But that coming of age story has another aspect or dimension that is often regulated to a footnote, namely the connection between humanism and dehumanization, end quote. So the Anthropocene discourse follows this same coming of age story as a humanist script, searching for a material origin story that would explain the newly identified trajectory of the anthropos as a geologic configuration that grapples with the excess and waste of modernity's rationalities and the material consequences of its imposition of reason in the dividuation of the earth and the individuation of subjects. As Scott suggests, the birth of humanism is also the birth of Europe's colonial project, so that quote, humanism and colonialism inhabit the same cognitive political universe, in so much as Europe's discovery of itself is simultaneous with its discovery of others, end quote. So the Fanon paradox of the invention of blackness has had much critical attention, yet the substance of that ordering, its geophysical properties rather than metaphysical dimensions, might also be thought to bear on the mobilizations of forces of energy and minerality in the world, as well as ongoing questions of environmental racism and injustice in material exposure to environmental events and toxic body burdens. That is to say, that humanism has a material gravity. And that gravity has an anti-black and brown ground. That is to say that Rhodes might fall, but his legacy of extraction remains in the stratification of South Africa's mines and its roots through London's imperial centres of exchange. So I want to suggest that the Inhumanities is a mean to reconceptualize and challenge the existing disciplinary approaches of the humanities that acknowledges rather than erases the collaborative junctures between metaphysical designations of the human and the geophysical praxis that brings subjective forms materially into being. This geologic praxis refers both to and to the extraction of natural and psychic resources for the maintenance of white heteropatriarchy, and how materiality regulates racist structures of extraction and subjugation. So I see race as a geophysical tool. In the Anthropocene, the human often comes into view, organized as it is around the telos of a coming catastrophe. And as Indigenous scholars remind us, the catastrophe came long ago, and extinction is not a neutral or future-orientated term. While the human is a ritual object of self-flagellation for Western thought through Enlightenment, then its critiques of post-colonialism, post-structuralism, and post-humanism, it nonetheless remains a dominant figure that marshals horizons of meaning within a kind of irrepressible recurrence. Because this is where meaning was made, as post-colonial thinkers such as Fanon, Glissant, Césaire, and Winter understood, it is also where meaning gets unmade or remade. So it's both a target and a site of possible emancipation with regards to racist structures of material engagement. Similarly, the inhuman is a site of traffic in subjective and material forms of life. So it's also a site of possibility for decolonizing the entanglements of race and geographical processes. As the category of the inhuman is posited as ahistorical, so in kind of deep or geologic time, or that which is placed outside of time of racial capitalism, in order to propel its notions of time and space. So it holds the potential for reimagining the dimensions of time and space. And it is a site for materially undoing racial capitalism. The onto-epistemal organization of anti-Black Earth matters for anti-racist struggles beyond questions of territory and environmental justice, because it's an epistemic inscription that conditions structures of thoughts and their institutional manifestation. Race provided the imposition of material poverty with a moral justification, reallocating the burden of destitution onto racial determinants rather than a systematic organization of material relations. So Black and Indigenous scholars have been theorizing this non-normativity of materiality for years, precisely because Black and Indigenous subjects are historically irreducible to the normative or the humanist subject. Furthermore, this anti-Black and brownness is materially and theoretically made concurrent with the inscription of the earth through grammars of geology within the colonial praxis and its afterlife. So this notality of emergence can be said to constitute an ontological inscription of Black, Indigenous, and Earth as the ground of the natural right of whiteness to consolidate the planet for the generation of value. So the historic geographical differences across which questions of geology and race travel are specific and varied, and by no means exclusive. But across the plateaus of colonialism, we can see race provided the political redemption for the white supremacy of matter, while the discourse of improvement brought race subjects and Indigenous land theft into the economic terraforming project of natural resources. Which is to say, the knowledge of the earth is also interned in a perspectivism and praxis of the supremacy of whiteness, which marks the capricious geography of the human, what Winter referred to as, quote, racially dominant white elite stratum, end quote, that propagated the development of natural resources as what she calls a secular telos of material redemption. So alongside and in different ways, scholars in Indigenous studies have argued and practiced for different ontological arrangements of the earth against settler colonial modes of extraction. And here I'm thinking about people like Leanne Simpson and Carl White, who you just heard from. So I think I've got a few more minutes left. Great. If we think about the Inhumanities as an analytic, it puts the kinship between the extraction of bodies and the extraction of earth at the core of its concerns about the possibilities and potentialities of lives, conjoining genocide and ecocide as tenets in the colonial project and its kin settler colonialism and resource colonialism. This move from a biocentric paradigm to a geocentric one includes rethinking how the social and political configurations of subjectivity have been thought and experienced in relation to the earth, whereby extraction drives a particular formation of what and who gets constituted as a natural resource, and where these activities of extraction take place in relation to the accumulation of value. So natural resources under colonialism and its afterlives in racial capitalism equals extraction plus capture, resulting in forms of epistemic and material enclosure for the production of value. We can see a parallel framing of personhood under slavery, whereby extraction from Africa and pre-colonial relations plus capture through the technology of race results in forms of material, so spatial extraction and containment and subjective enclosures. So developing a broader understanding of colonialism in relation to the integration between its knowledge and extraction networks, the emergence of geopower can be seen as a political and racial technology of governance of the present and of a set of resources that subtend the potentialities and exhaustions of life, as well as its cosmic potential. So the political importance of recognizing the inhuman in its material, epistemic, and conceptual forms is part of understanding the material transformation of the planet and how geologic grammars do geopolitical and geophysical work, which is also to understand how and where matter relations organize and arrange particular enduring forms of oppression as extraction economies traverse subjective and material regimes of value. So Fanon's conception of the wretched of the earth reminds us of the spatial and subjective conflation of colonials' understanding of vast populations of people and areas of the earth designated as matter awaiting extraction. Yet if the biopolitical frame is understood as always already constituted through an inhuman ground or racialized subjects, even as it is prized apart by liberatory inventions that refute that designation, the inhuman is what secures non-life and secures it differentially to produce the human as such. So the human, however, can never be incorporated into the political subject or being as such because of this material differentiation between a figure, the political subject of a judicial rights, and the ground, the matter of resource, to enable the becoming of a political subject philosophically and materially. Thus, politics and practices of making non-life within a discourse of biopolitics and its sites of concern in terms of bodies, so the alienated human subject, the subject without rights, and places like camps, zones of exception, etc., remain exclusively within the domain of the human, as it's designated by what Winter calls a partial humanism that organizes history for man, quote, history for man, therefore narrated and existed, existentially lived as if it were history for the human itself. So man thus represents himself as if he were the full scale and sense of the human and reproduces those epistemic modes of life as life. So kind of excluding the differential of the inhuman on which that life is built. So as Kathryn McKittrick argues in Demonic Grounds, what would happen if we put Black geographies at the center of our analysis? What kind of geography would that produce, and how would it shift the questions we ask? The mine and the plantation are both geosocial formations of the New World. What is important to notice is that they are both social institutions of extraction, the mine and the factory, and they are bio-geo engines that rearrange the earth and ecology. In other words, because of their repeatability across the Americas and empire, the material praxis of mine and plantation completely rearranged the geochemical flows of the world, setting into place changed ecological and social relations that are racialized. So this geophysics of the mine and the plantation create the metaphysical conditions of the burden of being categorized as Black. These geosocial arrangements are a geophysics of power. So if we think with this double life of the inhuman as matter and race, inhumanity is in short a savage form of subjectivity that is organized as a category and thus a subjugation for phenotypically designated populations through the operation of race within the historical geographies of colonialism. As new forms of racialized beings were articulated through the 16th to 19th century in paleontology in the context of colonialism, geology was also articulating new origins of the earth, as well as forming the material praxis of their rearrangement. So through mining, ecological arrangements, extractions, dams, geologic displacements, fertilizers, and the introduction of alien animals. So the inhuman is not simply an alienated form of the human, as it is most often encountered as a non-human referent that stands in for the animal form or a kind of reminder of the animal root or a pathologizing slur. But it's also a historically materially situated occurrence, and it's a form of differentiation in both matter and time, whereby the division and spacing of the genomic or organic principles of life are set in contrast to the inorganic. So new modes of histories of life attempted to declassify man as an animal and reclassify him as a cultural ethnic being, producing ontologies that operationalize hierarchies and ordering systems. For Winter, what is called the West rather than the Latin Christian Europe begins with the founding of post-1492 Caribbean. Winter challenges the geographical imaginary that the Americas and the Caribbean are somehow an epistemological outside to Western knowledge, in which people wrote, quote, not realizing the condition of their being, what they are today, and the linked. that you can't separate the strands of the very same historical process, which has by and large enriched their lives and at the same time largely impoverished the lives of the majority of our Caribbean people, end quote. So if we begin in the colonial slave mind and the plantation, the ground that sustains this production is the geologic of the inhuman as nature, matter, and race. Without the geologic of the inhuman as object and subject, the entire mechanism that produced the material relation between Europe and the New World and the humanistic subject falls away. And thus the inhuman, as well as a source of subjection, is also a site of possibility, because that category of regression is always being transgressed, and other relations were being instigated that spoke to the possibility of other relations to the earth. Everywhere the inhumane is imposed, it is resisted by a humanism that highlights the dark contours of the humanist subject in its partiality. Thus, the anti-colonial critique is not simply a critique of the inadequacies of the human or a better humanism, but it's a counter-imaginary that opens up the fullness of the register of the earth as relation, rather than world as extractable earth. And I could end there, or I could just summarize. I'm not sure how I'm doing for time.
You have time to summarize, and then we can turn to questions.
Okay. So this is a kind of checklist for the Inhumanities. So for me, the Inhumanities raises some important questions for the environmental humanities. And firstly, that's kind of how we reconstruct the dual root of race and materiality in geographies of environmental change, and the doubling of race as both a metaphysical and a geophysical claim in historical geographies of colonialism. And second, by locating inherently racist structures and histories of materialism that go beyond the identification of territorial theft and material acquisition and reside in the epistemes of geologic classification and value. So how we value the geology and its kind of crafts and forms of aesthetic production. Three, the necessity of dismantling the grammar of geology that stabilizes the inhuman as an object of property, which first requires an understanding of how it functions as a mode of social and environmental ascription in an epistemic mode, alongside the planetary practice of extraction. Four, a recognition of the primacy of material environmental rather than ideological structurings of race, which in turn changes the spaces and structures of thought that are marshaled for anti-racist action. So there's no turning to the planet to do away with race, and no planetary commons that is not at the same time in need of decolonization. The inhuman is a starting point from which to rethink material redistributions of geopower and its racialized carceral modes. So the Inhumanities is a counter-conceptualization of the environmental humanities that foregrounds the role of the politics of non-life and the figure of the inhuman as the political figure of an earthbound commons that undoes an extractive account of matter. So a politics of non-life predicated not on necropolitics or a biopolitical mode of address is a way to think about the emergence of subjective modes and the earth, a way that is not already conditioned by the subjugation of biopolitical exclusions and the promise of inclusion held beyond the abysmal ground of dispossession and the material life of racial inequality. So this is not about an inclusionary mode, but reinvention, to paraphrase Fanon, of being in the residue of the inhumane, in the abandoned depths of its inhuman categories. And finally, there's no humanist subject without the intramural question of the materiality of race. There's no environmental humanities without the question of racial justice. The inhuman is an epistemological site for the undoing of geographies of colonial materialities in the present tense. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yusoff. I've opened up the chat for any questions. Let's see. Shall we? Well, I guess while people are formulating ideas and thoughts and questions, I would like to return to one of your slides actually. Here, I will let's see, I'm just going to turn off the screen sharing. Is that good? Or do you want to stay inside your
No, that's okay.
presentation? Oh, okay. Okay, wonderful. Yes, and so I was thinking if we could return to one of the quotes you had. Again, thank you for this kind of wonderful breadth of sources and materials and poetics and images that are so rich. I was struck by the quote that I wasn't sure exactly whose quote it was, but the idea that poetic knowledge was born in great silence, the silence of science. And I wondered if you might speak a little bit more to that particular quote, but also in your work in relation to that idea of the power of poetic knowledge, moving outside or alongside or in subduction of the scientific epistemes.
Yeah, I mean, it's an excellent question, and it's I mean, I think kind of what I mean, the quote is from Amy Césaire, and what he's talking to is the way in which you can't sort of come back at the same languages of oppression with the same language, that there's a need to kind of forge, and the poetic becomes a way to forge a kind of politics. Angela Ask calls this undoing geopolitics through geopoetics, as a way to kind of think about a strategy of geopolitics that both gives back kind of the space for kind of a redress of subjectivity, but also kind of redress of those languages of extraction. So both kind of poetry and art have been really important in the project that I've been in terms of just thinking about how you address these grammars that are so kind of, I mean, particularly sort of terms like natural resources, which are so kind of seeped in our imaginary and in our kind of, that it's almost like difficult to conceive of a set of languages outside of that for talking about kind of how kind of materiality moves around the planet. So that's kind of, I think, both it's obviously a much broader challenge than what I've been working on. I've been trying to work on sort of uncovering these histories. But I think it's already, we're at a point in time where actually that's sort of really kind of trying to forge new languages and to sort of take inspiration from the ways in which kind of post-colonial thinkers like Césaire and Glissant really kind of grappled with how to think a new subjectivity and a new kind of form of phylation, so a new form of kind of genealogy outside of the kind of imperial organization of those terms. So I think that's a really kind of exciting place to think about creative practice.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. We have a question from Dr. Johanna Goss, who says, thank you for the stunning presentation. Could you situate the Inhumanities vis-a-vis post-humanism a bit further?
I mean, I think kind of in some ways, like what I wanted to sort of communicate was that rather than a kind of inhumanism, rather than it being a kind of post, but kind of an after the kind of humanities, or a critique of the humanities, it's really the ground of the humanities. So like thinking with the sort of humanities as the figure, and actually just thinking about, okay, what's the material substantiation that holds that up? And then if we think about kind of the inhumanities as the ground of the inhuman, it can never be incorporated into the human. So it can never be kind of post-human or a kind of critique of the human, because it's the very thing that the human sort of needs to stand up to be embodied. And so I think kind of, for me, that sets a challenge. And I think we see this really in the work of kind of Afro-pessimism, in a sense of that sort of, like I find Afro-pessimism a really optimistic engagement with the kind of the sort of voids of subjectivity, for example, and it's there in Fanon. And to actually just think about how that was worked with and kind of, and that, like Liston says, it's very much part of a history and a becoming, and becoming something other, and coming back at the sort of the will of the slavers, with something very different and kind of poetic and open towards these kind of forces of the universe.
Thank you. Well, I know sometimes it's a little inhibiting to post things in the in the chat, so I'm also happy if folks want to ask questions directly in video. So feel free to do that. I think we've got a good group for that. If anyone has any questions.
I'll take a stab at a question. I was wondering if you could speak briefly, about the relationship between what you're calling geopower, or the inhuman as a form of differentiation, and Elizabeth Povinelli's geontopower, which I'm a little bit more familiar with. So it seems like both are concerned with this division between life and non-life. I understand Povinelli to be talking about it as a tactic of late liberalism, right? And that sort of, people who have actual analytics of existence into those who only have cultural beliefs. And so how does your work maybe depart from that or engage with that?
Yeah, really great question. I've actually written a chapter on this because I wanted to work through because actually I think it's a really, so geopower was something that Elizabeth Gross very generously gave us an American an AAG meeting as this sort of term to kind of talk about the sort of forces of the earth and the forces of the cosmos. I understand kind of what Povinelli's doing is talking about the governance of that boundary between life and non-life as a kind of producing this politics, and this particular politics of late settler liberalism. I think when Elizabeth Gross was using it, and she kind of used it, in a kind of generous gift to us geographers, and we were, why haven't we come up with this term on our own? She was talking about how kind of, and she was talking in the context of art practice particularly, but also for forms of territorialization, how they harness geopowers. And I mean, I've sort of taken that on in thinking about the way in which kind of value is accrued from the earth as kind of, as a kind of harnessing of these geopowers. So we can see, like if we think about sort of petropatriarchy, for example, that's a harnessing of a certain geopower into this kind of social form. So for me, kind of geopower is not sort of an original condition, but it's a kind of, it's kind of beyond kind of governance in a sense. It's sort of the power of the earth and the way that gets sort of channeled into these geosocial formations. So I think that's sort of why I would see the difference. And then I would also see kind of there's a useful conversation to have a sort of with Sylvia Winter's work as well, in terms of kind of rethinking that through and in relation to race. But if anybody's interested in the chapter, it's in the Handbook of Political Geography, I think. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting. I think kind of Povinelli's work in terms of understanding intimacies of that sort of geontopower is really incredible. And really kind of, one of the sort of first in social theory to really start thinking about what it means to have a rock in the family, and how you begin to think with kind of these inhuman forms that are so excluded from Western social thought. Of course, they're not excluded from lots of other, indigenous thought.
We've got a question from Ruth Ellen Coker, who says she has to meet with the dean right now, but she's asked a question about the Fanon quote, "A drop of sun in the earth." Doesn't this speak to a robust need for Fanon to engage a deformation of mastery in language or the grammar of geology co-opted by Europeans? That is, in terms of geological references adjacent to Black and Brown peoples, What was a matter of pride, religion, cultural origin stories became that which was leveled against them in the justification for the enslavement as further from the body of intellect connoted by European man. So yeah, I don't know if you want to say anything else about that phenomenon specifically, but I guess deformation of mastery of language, something that of course was infused within your talk.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that I quite I'm not quite hearing the question in there, but I think, you know, that it's an interesting, I guess what is striking about Fanon and also about sort of Amy Césair's discourse on colonialism is the way in which they kind of, there is this location in the cosmic, and that's what kind of I really wanted to, before I've been sort of in previous work kind of thinking about race, the inhuman as kind of race and matter, and actually, you know, missing in a sense the kind of liberatory or the kind of the freedoming spaces within that, which is the cosmos, right? Is the kind of, which holds all these timescales and forms of kind of life and energy and kind of movement that are completely irreducible by colonialism, even as those kind of geopowers are channeled into. So I think, you know, it's really historically interesting to see how the cosmic becomes this place to locate freedom, and to think a different kind of material relation to the earth. So that's just what I was trying to sort of signal there in a very sort of, but yeah, there's lots to be said about Fanon.
Yes, I think she's kind of questioning, yeah, how Fanon fits in at some level with language work. We have a great question from Marcella, an artist here at CU. It says, incredibly insightful as to how racism functions in the Inhumanities and geologic realism. How does speciesism fit into this puzzle? Where does this leave the many non-human animals? You've explained the impact and functioning of these systems on humans. Where do non-human animals fit in? How are they impacted in the context of the Inhumanities?
Yeah, I mean, great question. The sort of, I mean, in sort of particularly in the 19th century, where race starts to kind of be talked about as and used and deployed as a term, it's almost kind of interchangeable with species. So there's this kind of movement between the two terms, and I think kind of Haraway talks about how kind of sticky that relationship is between species and race. That anytime you start off talking about species, you end up talking about race. And so where does that leave the non-humans? I mean, I think kind of for me, what I'm trying to kind of get at is this segregation, you know, and it's a segregation from the sort of inhuman world, but it's also a segregation from non-human. I mean, like these are kind of between man and nature, those and man in scare quotes. You know, those are kind of forms of separation that have allowed kind of, you know, kind of all these forms of non-relation to be scripted into forms of extraction. So rethinking kind of relation with non-humans, with rocks, with kind of, I mean, the thing is, like, non-human life is never like kind of, it's never dead. It's, you know, there's rocks are also evolving. There's, you know, there's geologic evolution. So these things are always kind of, you know, and as we're finding out to our peril, are completely sort of interlocked. So I would say that non-humans are right there at the center of that story. And, you know, I've just kind of concentrated on this division because I think it's maybe, you know, after there's been a real engagement with the biological and with biocentric thought. And actually the basis of biocentric thought is a kind of geocentric thought. And so that often gets taken as read. And that's what I was trying to unground in the Inhumanities.
Thank you. We've got a question from my colleague in Art History and a co-PI on the Mellon, Dr. Brianne Cohen. She says, thank you so much for the excellent talk. I'm very interested in your retaining the term inhuman and inhumanism versus Singh's proposition of dehumanism. Could you summarize again your advocacy of the idea of the inhumanities as a counter-imaginary versus dehumanism?
I mean, I think, you know, I think that that book actually, Undoing Mastery, is like really fantastic, and I just kind of went back to it actually for thinking about this talk, and so what she says is that sort of dehumanism really gets at the kind of what's, you know, the kind of process or practice of dehumanizing, and that the inhuman is counterintuitive because it seems to be about kind of non-human things. So my kind of attachment to the inhuman is really because of that counterintuitive nature of thinking about the inhuman, and, you know, trying to think kind of subjectivity through the inhuman requires us to, in some ways, sort of go against our kind of practices of thought. So it's a kind of, it is a way to kind of mobilize a certain sort of letting go of kind of terms. So that's why I've kind of stuck with the inhuman. But I'm also kind of, you know, I am like very interested in human worlds, and their kind of different temporal processes. So hopefully that answers.
Yes, she says, thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, are there any final questions? Well, thank you so much, Dr. Yusoff. It's been such a pleasure to have you, an honor to have you here, and we're so grateful for your time today. Thank you.
Thank you all. It's really great to engage with you all and to see you as well. Yeah.
Thank you all so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.